Before the words, "in the beginning," were ever written, before Genesis was whispered in the sacred tongue of ancient scribes, humanity already carried the memory of creation in its heart. Across deserts, river valleys, and mountains that predated any holy text, people told stories of the first man and woman, of gods who shaped them from dust, clay, or divine breath. They did not yet know of Adam or Eve, but they spoke of the same longing, the same divine touch that brought life into motion. To understand Adam and Eve, one must journey far beyond the Garden of Eden, into the mythic landscapes that preceded it, where gods molded humanity from the earth, and sacred trees stood at the center of the world. These stories, echoing across millennia, formed the spiritual soil from which the biblical creation would later grow. In Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved life into the land, humanity's first creators were already imagined. The Sumerians told of Enki, the god of wisdom and water, who fashioned humans from clay to serve the divine realm. His consort, the mother goddess Ninhursag, gave form to flesh. Together they shaped men and women not as random beings, but as vessels of purpose, a mirror for the divine essence. In their myths, one can already sense the seeds of Eden. The clay of Ninhursag's creation bears a striking resemblance to the dust from which Adam was formed. Her breath of life, shared by the god Enki, resonates with the breath of Yahweh, who breathed life into Adam's nostrils. Yet the intention of these ancient stories was not merely to explain human origin, it was to reveal relationship between creator and creation, obedience and freedom, order and chaos. In the city of Eridu, known as one of the world's first cities, Enki's temple stood as a symbolic garden, lush, watered by canals, filled with sacred plants. It was said to be a place where no sickness or death existed, where divine beings walked freely. And there, humanity's first disobedience was also recorded. According to one tale, when Enki gave the knowledge of fertility and life to humanity, gifts reserved for the gods, he angered the Great Mother, who cursed him for revealing divine secrets. Knowledge and transgression intertwined, just as they would in the story of Eden. But the echoes grow louder when we cross the borders of Mesopotamia and enter the myths of Babylon. There, the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes the rise of gods out of chaos and the forming of mankind from the blood of a defeated god. In that act lies a mystery, humanity born from both divine essence and rebellion. This fusion of purity and defiance, of dust and divinity, would later find its reflection in Adam's fall, a being of sacred origin, yet bound to the consequence of choice. In Egypt, the tale was different but strangely familiar. The god Khnum, depicted as a ram-headed craftsman, molded humans from the clay of the Nile on his potter's wheel. Nearby stood the goddess Isis, who breathed life into their nostrils. Again, the same symbolism emerges: clay and breath, earth and spirit. It seems that across every early civilization, humankind was shaped not only by divine hands, but by the eternal duality of material and spiritual essence. Perhaps this is why the biblical author of Genesis, writing centuries later, drew from images already ancient when Abraham walked the earth. The Hebrews had journeyed through Mesopotamia and Egypt, through lands heavy with myth and divine memory. The symbols they inherited were not inventions of men, but ancient reflections of truths humanity had always known: that life springs from sacred origin, and that the first man and woman were more than mere mortals. They were archetypes of divine image and human fallibility. The story of Eden, when read through this lens, becomes less a historical account and more a sacred echo of something timeless. The tree, the serpent, the garden, all appear in older forms long before Genesis, yet the Bible transforms them into moral and spiritual metaphors. For example, the Sumerian myth of Inanna's descent into the underworld mentions a sacred garden guarded by spirits, and within it, a tree called Hulapu, from which the goddess sought wisdom. The parallels are unmistakable: a divine woman, a sacred tree, and the pursuit of forbidden knowledge. Yet the difference lies not in the details, but in the direction of meaning. Pagan myths celebrated the gaining of divine knowledge as power or transformation. Genesis, however, teaches that knowledge without obedience becomes exile. The myth becomes morality. The ancient story becomes divine instruction. Still, these early myths cannot be dismissed as mere coincidence. They are the language of humanity's earliest spiritual intuition, a language that the authors of Genesis would later sanctify. The connection between the pagan and the biblical is not one of imitation, but of revelation unfolding through time. Humanity, in its infancy, saw God's reflection dimly through myth. Later, in sacred scripture, that reflection would become light. As the Israelites settled among nations steeped in mythic traditions, their own understanding of creation was refined. When the Genesis account was finally written, possibly during or after the Babylonian exile, it was framed as both a memory and a protest, a reassertion that one God, not many, created humanity, and that this creation was good, not the outcome of divine war or chaos. In this way, the story of Adam and Eve did not reject the pagan myths, but purified their symbols. The clay, the breath, the garden, the forbidden fruit, all retained yet transformed. The serpent, too, has older roots. In Mesopotamia, serpents symbolized both healing and wisdom. The god Ningish-Zida, often represented as a serpent, was guardian of the tree of truth. In Egypt, the serpent Mehen encircled the sun god Ra, protecting him from darkness. In these older myths, the serpent was not evil but a divine intermediary, a symbol of power, renewal, and secret knowledge. Genesis would redefine it forever, turning wisdom into temptation, and the symbol of eternity into the agent of the fall. Why did the ancient authors do this? Perhaps because they sought to shift humanity's gaze from gods made in our image to a God who made us in his. The pagan serpent gave knowledge. The biblical serpent offered rebellion. The tree gave life. Now it became a test of obedience. The same symbols were kept, but their moral gravity was reversed. And so, the story of Adam and Eve stands as a sacred mirror to the world's oldest myths. It acknowledges their imagery, yet redirects their meaning toward the one Creator. Where Enki's gift brought punishment, Yahweh's breath brought grace. Where Isis gave life to mortals, God gave them his image. The ancient myths sought to explain man's existence. Genesis sought to explain his purpose. As dawn rose over the cradle of civilization, humanity's collective memory carried these truths in fragments. From Sumerian clay tablets to Egyptian hymns, from Babylonian stone to Hebrew scrolls, one theme endured: that humankind was shaped from the earth, animated by divine spirit, and set within a sacred garden of choice. The garden may change its name, Eridu, Dilmun, or Eden, but its essence remains the same. It is the meeting place between divinity and humanity, between innocence and awakening. It is where every civilization, in its own tongue, first tried to describe the mystery of being alive. And deep beneath these overlapping myths, one question persisted: why would a perfect creator give imperfect beings the power to choose? The answer, perhaps, lies not in clay or breath, but in love, a love that allows freedom, even at the cost of exile. Here, in the soil of ancient myth, the story of Adam and Eve begins to take root. It is not born from denial of older gods, but from a divine reinterpretation of humanity's oldest dream: to walk with God in a garden, to know him, and to fall from him, only to seek him again. When we step deeper into the mists of antiquity, the Garden of Eden begins to dissolve into an older, broader vision, one that stretches across many cultures and faiths. The image of a sacred garden, radiant and eternal, existed long before the Hebrew scribes inscribed the story of Eden on papyrus. It was known by many names: the Sumerian Dilmun, the Persian Paradisa, a walled paradise from which the very word paradise descends, and the Egyptian fields of reeds, where souls walked beside calm waters beneath the gaze of immortal gods. Each of these gardens held the same sacred truth: a perfect space where humans and the divine once lived in harmony. The Sumerians spoke of Dilmun as a land untouched by death or sickness. It was a realm where lions did not devour, wolves did not seize lambs, and the raven's cry of mourning was never heard. There, the gods themselves walked in peace, and humans knew no pain. But, as in every paradise, this perfection could not last. The story tells that the goddess Ninhursag, the same divine mother who molded humanity, once abandoned Dilmun after a quarrel with Enki. In her absence, the land became barren, life ceased to flow. Only when she returned, moved by compassion, did fertility bloom again. Thus the fall from grace, a theme that would echo eternally, first appeared not as punishment but as consequence, the natural rhythm of separation and return. Thousands of years later, when the Hebrew people spoke of Eden, they inherited these echoes. Yet they reframed them in a monotheistic light. Eden was not merely a mythic paradise. It was a covenantal space, a place of relationship, moral responsibility, and divine presence. Where the Sumerians saw cycles of divine quarrels and reconciliations, the Israelites saw a moral universe ordered by one Creator, whose love required obedience. Even the very word Eden may reflect ancient layers of language. Some scholars trace it to the Sumerian word Edenu, meaning plain or steppe, which itself may have derived from the Akkadian Edenu, a word that described fertile floodplains nourished by rivers. Others see in it the meaning delight or pleasure, suggesting that Eden was both a place and a state of being, an inner and outer harmony. This linguistic fusion of geography and spirituality reveals something profound. The ancient mind did not separate the sacred from the natural world. The garden was not a metaphor. It was reality infused with holiness. In many ancient myths, this garden was always guarded by gods, spirits, or sacred creatures. In Sumer, the mythic Dilmun was protected by divine beings who controlled its entry. In Egypt, the gateway to the fields of reeds was guarded by serpents and lions, challenging the soul's purity. The Bible preserves this same motif. When Adam and Eve are cast out, cherubim are set to guard the way back, their flaming swords crossing like the horizon itself. It is an image not of wrath, but of divine distance, a barrier placed between imperfection and eternity. Yet before exile, there was union. In the oldest myths, humanity's first moments in the garden were filled with intimacy between Creator and creation. The Egyptian Book of the Dead describes how the souls of the righteous walk in the garden of the gods, their feet treading on the flowers of heaven. In Babylonian poetry, the gods feast beneath sacred trees while humans serve them, not as slaves but as companions in a divine ecosystem. It was a world without shame, without labor, without death, a mirror of the first chapters of Genesis, where Adam and Eve live in the peace of divine friendship. But peace cannot exist without awareness, and awareness is a dangerous gift. This truth pulses through every ancient myth. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero's companion Enkidu begins as a wild man, living among animals in a primal innocence. Only when he meets the temple maiden, Shamhat, and experiences love, does he awaken to consciousness. The animals flee from him, and his innocence dies. He has eaten, in a sense, of forbidden fruit. Knowledge separates him from nature, just as the fruit of Eden separates Adam and Eve from the garden. It is striking that in these early stories, the awakening of humanity is always linked to a woman, not as a symbol of sin, but as a bringer of knowledge. Shamhat teaches Enkidu the ways of civilization. The goddess Inanna grants divine wisdom to her priests. Isis reveals the secret name of Ra to gain cosmic understanding. These were acts of empowerment, of revelation. In Genesis, however, the pattern shifts. Eve's act of reaching for knowledge is recast as disobedience, the moment of fall. Yet even here, the echo of older myths remains. The woman as seeker of divine truth, as bridge between the mortal and the transcendent. To grasp the meaning of this transformation, one must see how the Hebrew story reinterprets, rather than rejects, its mythic inheritance. In pagan traditions, the gods themselves were bound by fate. In Genesis, fate yields to morality. The gods of old acted upon impulse. Yahweh acts through purpose. The tree of knowledge, once a symbol of divine favor, becomes a moral test, not to withhold wisdom, but to teach discernment. Knowledge, in itself, is not evil. It becomes dangerous only when taken without trust. The image of the tree stands at the heart of all these ancient cosmologies. The Sumerians had the Hulapu tree, rooted at the banks of the Euphrates, around which the goddess Inanna built her throne. The Babylonians imagined the tree of life rising in the center of the world, connecting heaven, earth, and the underworld, a cosmic axis that sustained creation. The Norse would later call it Yggdrasil. The Hebrews placed their own tree in Eden, transforming it from a cosmic structure into a moral one. What once connected worlds now divides destinies. The tree of knowledge and the tree of life were not random inventions. They were ancient symbols redefined. The first represented the human capacity to choose, to discern good from evil, to bear the weight of moral consciousness. The second symbolized eternal communion with God. Together, they expressed the two great tensions of existence, freedom and immortality. To eat from one was to awaken. To eat from both was to become divine. That, perhaps, is why humanity was allowed one but not the other. The journey of faith begins not in perfection but in separation. In the Sumerian world, divine gardens were also the domain of the gods of fertility and rebirth. The myth of Tammuz and Inanna tells of a young god who dies and descends to the underworld, only to return each spring. The garden blooms with his resurrection. In the Hebrew story, the garden withers not because of a god's death, but because of man's disobedience. The myth turns inward. The fall becomes not a cosmic tragedy, but a human one. Every ancient culture recognized that the garden, whether real or symbolic, represented humanity's longing to return to divine harmony. The difference with Genesis lies in its direction. The old myths told of gods who needed humanity's offerings to sustain paradise. The Bible tells of a God who gives paradise freely, and humanity who loses it by choice. The same garden, yet a different relationship. One may wonder how the early Israelites came to reshape these motifs so profoundly. The answer lies in exile. In the Babylonian captivity, when Jewish scribes lived among temples and tablets filled with ancient creation tales. There they encountered the Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the hymns of Ishtar. They saw the grandeur and despair of a world that worshipped many gods, yet found no moral anchor. Their response was not to deny the past, but to sanctify it, to take its imagery and breathe into it new meaning, as Yahweh once breathed life into clay. Thus, the Garden of Eden becomes not only a myth of beginnings, but a statement of faith. It proclaims that humanity's origin is divine, its fall moral, and its redemption possible. The pagan legends whispered of cycles, death and rebirth, creation and destruction. Genesis speaks of a linear path, a beginning, a fall, and a hope for restoration. This transformation marks one of the greatest shifts in the history of human thought, from myth to meaning, from fate to freedom. As we leave the gates of Eden for the first time, we begin to sense the profound paradox at the core of creation. Humanity is both the image of God and the dust of the earth, capable of knowing good and evil, yet destined to toil and die. This tension is the true inheritance of the ancient myths. The gods once played out this drama among themselves. Now it unfolds within the human heart. And so, the story of Adam and Eve continues, not merely as the record of two people, but as the timeless reflection of humanity's awakening. Behind them, the garden fades into memory. Before them stretches the long path of history, haunted by the memory of paradise and guided by the hope of return. In every civilization that told of the world's beginning, there slithered a figure both feared and revered: the serpent. Long before the serpent tempted Eve beneath the canopy of Eden, it was a divine symbol of wisdom, transformation, and eternal renewal. The snake sheds its skin and emerges reborn, its old self cast aside. Ancient people saw in this mystery a reflection of the human soul: death followed by renewal, ignorance followed by enlightenment. Yet, in Genesis, this ancient emblem of immortality would be recast as the harbinger of humanity's fall. In Mesopotamian myth, the serpent was not the enemy of man. In fact, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it was the serpent who guarded the secret of eternal life. After the hero's long journey in search of immortality, he finds a sacred plant at the bottom of the sea that promises rejuvenation. But as he rests, a serpent steals the plant and slithers away, renewing its youth as it disappears. Humanity's hope for eternal life vanishes with it. The serpent, here, is not evil. It is the eternal guardian of divine secrets, ensuring that immortality remains the privilege of the gods. The echo of this story in the forbidden tree is unmistakable. In Egypt, the serpent held even more sacred weight. The cobra, Uraeus, coiled upon the crowns of pharaohs, symbolized divine authority and protection. The serpent goddess Wadjet was the eye of Ra, the solar deity, burning with the light of justice. And yet, there was also Apep, the great serpent of chaos, who fought each night to devour the sun. The Egyptians did not see the serpent as good or evil in isolation. It was both, a living paradox. The snake represented the dual forces of creation and destruction, life and death intertwined. This duality passed into every corner of the ancient Near East. To the Canaanites, the serpent was a creature of power and healing. The god Baal was sometimes shown battling a sea serpent, the monster Lotan, symbolizing the eternal struggle between order and chaos. The Hebrews, inheriting this imagery, preserved it but transformed its meaning. In the Book of Numbers, Moses raises a bronze serpent upon a pole, and all who look upon it are healed from their deadly bites. The same creature that brought harm now brings salvation, a foreshadowing of the biblical paradox that what once symbolized the fall might one day represent redemption. When the serpent of Genesis enters the garden, it carries with it the weight of all these ancient meanings. It is the voice of knowledge, of awakening, of temptation. But unlike its pagan ancestors, this serpent is not divine. It is subtle. It speaks not as a god, but as a whisper. Its power lies not in magic or might, but in persuasion. Did God really say? It questions, it twists, it awakens doubt. And in that doubt, humanity begins to think for itself. What is truly forbidden in Eden is not knowledge itself, but the attempt to seize divine wisdom apart from divine timing. The serpent's temptation is the same in every age: to take before we are ready, to know without understanding, to ascend without obedience. Pagan myths often celebrated this transgression: Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, Inanna descending into the underworld to claim its secrets, Isis extracting the hidden name of Ra. But the biblical writer saw a deeper cost in such acts. Knowledge divorced from humility leads to separation, not enlightenment. Still, one cannot help but notice that Eve's act, reaching for the fruit, is also the beginning of consciousness. Before the bite, there is innocence but not understanding. After it, there is pain, but also awareness. The eyes of Adam and Eve are opened, and they perceive good and evil, self and other, shame and freedom. In that moment, they step out of myth and into morality. The serpent becomes the midwife of humanity's awakening. This is why the serpent's role is more complex than mere villainy. It embodies the eternal tension between obedience and discovery. The pagans saw the serpent as the path to wisdom. The Bible transforms it into the test of wisdom. What was once the guardian of divine truth now becomes the tempter towards self-deification. The story's meaning evolves, yet the symbol endures. Even within later Hebrew tradition, the serpent retained this ambivalence. In the book of Job, God describes the Leviathan, a monstrous sea serpent, as a creature of awe that no man can tame. It is both creation and chaos, proof of divine power beyond human comprehension. In this, the serpent remains a reminder of the limits of human knowledge, and of the mystery that still guards the gates of paradise. The motif of forbidden knowledge was not unique to the Hebrews. In the Babylonian myth of Adapa, often called the first man, we find a story that almost mirrors the Eden narrative. Adapa, created by the god Ea, the Babylonian form of Enki, is wise but mortal. One day, he breaks the wing of the south wind, angering the sky god Anu. Ea warns Adapa not to eat the food or drink the water offered to him in heaven, for it would bring death. But in truth, it was the food of immortality. Obeying his creator's warning, Adapa refuses, and thus loses eternal life. A man, obedient to his god, forfeits immortality because of deception cloaked in faith. The resonance with Adam's story is profound. Both men are denied eternal life due to divine command. Both stand between obedience and immortality. And yet, the biblical version offers a different lesson. Where Adapa is punished for obedience, Adam is punished for disobedience. The tension reveals a divine paradox, that the essence of humanity lies not in blind obedience nor in reckless rebellion, but in the ability to choose. Free will, that most divine of gifts, carries both the power to fall and the power to rise. It is worth reflecting that in Hebrew, the word for serpent, nachash, also carries connotations of enchantment, whispering, and shining. Some ancient interpreters saw in this a suggestion that the serpent was not merely an animal, but a radiant being, a manifestation of spiritual intelligence. The idea of a luminous deceiver, one who brings false light, would later shape theological concepts of Satan, the fallen one who appears as an angel of light. Yet, in its earliest form, the serpent is not personified evil. It is the embodiment of the human struggle between trust and desire. From a symbolic perspective, the serpent represents that part of humanity that seeks divinity prematurely. It is the voice that says, "You shall be as gods." In pagan lore, this was a promise. In biblical revelation, it becomes a warning. But perhaps the two are not so different. To become godlike without God is the oldest temptation in the world. The myths of Enki, Prometheus, and Inanna all celebrate this ambition, yet each ends in suffering, exile, or punishment. The moral is universal. Enlightenment without reverence leads to ruin. When Adam and Eve eat the fruit, they do not merely disobey, they awaken. Their eyes open to duality, to the separation of self and other, of good and evil. This awakening is both a fall and a birth. It is the loss of paradise, but also the birth of history. For without knowledge, there is no story to tell, no journey to undertake, no redemption to seek. The serpent's whisper, though cursed, sets in motion the divine drama of salvation. In the ancient worldview, divine punishment was never the end of the story. It was the beginning of understanding. When Enki was cursed for giving knowledge to humanity, the gods eventually restored him, recognizing that wisdom, even when misused, is the seed of progress. Likewise, when Adam and Eve are exiled, God still clothes them. The same hands that formed them from dust now cover their shame. The serpent has spoken, the fruit has been eaten, and humanity stands trembling at the threshold of a new world, no longer innocent, yet not abandoned. The serpent thus becomes a symbol of paradox, the bringer of fall and the awakener of spirit. Pagan myths celebrated it as divine. Genesis humbles it, yet allows its truth to remain, that knowledge always comes with a cost, and wisdom must be redeemed through grace. And so, the ancient serpent moves across the ages, from Sumerian temple walls to Hebrew scrolls, shedding its meanings like skin. It is the whisper in every human heart that seeks to know, to transcend, to return to the garden, not as a child, but as one who understands the price of awakening. In the great tapestry of creation myths that predated the book of Genesis, the first man and woman were never mere mortals. They were mirrors of the divine. The ancients understood that to speak of the beginning was to speak of relationship, between earth and heaven, between matter and spirit, between the masculine and the feminine forces that shape all existence. In every culture, these forces were personified as god and goddess, creator and nurturer, sun and moon. And it is within this sacred duality that the story of Adam and Eve finds its deepest echoes. The Sumerians, who lived millennia before the Hebrews, told of the creation of man and woman through divine partnership. The god Enki, master of wisdom and the subterranean waters, joined with Ninhursag, the great mother goddess, to form human life from the clay of the earth. Ninhursag was not a passive figure. She was the womb of creation, the one who brought divine energy into form. Her name means Lady of the Mountain, symbolizing the place where heaven meets earth. Together, Enki and Ninhursag embodied a cosmic marriage, the union of intellect and nature, spirit and substance. In their myth, humanity was born not from isolation, but from harmony. This archetype of divine duality can be seen everywhere. In Egypt, the gods Shu and Tefnut emerged from the breath of the Creator and gave birth to Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. The world began when the sky bent down to embrace the earth, yet the two were separated to allow creation to unfold. In Greece, Gaia and Uranus formed a similar pair, earth and sky, mother and father, locked in an eternal dance. And in each of these myths, humanity was seen as the offspring of this sacred balance, a reflection of both divine order and creative chaos. Genesis, too, begins with a duality, not of gods, but of God and his creation. "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness," says the divine voice. The plural pronoun us has long stirred curiosity. Was it the royal we, the heavenly court of angels, or an echo of the ancient memory of divine partnership? The text itself does not say. Yet what follows is clear. Male and female he created them. In that single verse, the unity of the divine manifests in human duality. Man and woman together reflect the full image of God. Long before Eve was formed from Adam's side, the ancient world already told of female counterparts drawn from male essence. In Sumerian myth, Enki's rib became the seat of life when he was healed by Ninhursag. The goddess fashioned 8 deities to cure his ailments, each representing a part of his body. One of them was named Ninti, the Lady of the Rib, or the Lady of Life. Thousands of years later, the Hebrew word Shava, Eve, would mean precisely the same, the mother of all living. It is almost as though the ancient word itself survived, reinterpreted through the light of monotheism. In this way, the story of Eve's creation is not merely derivative, but transformative. The earlier myths depicted woman as divine healer or co-creator. Genesis makes her the companion of man, equal in origin though different in role. She is not sculpted from dust but drawn from living flesh, signifying not subordination but unity, a being of shared essence, not separate creation. "Bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh," Adam says, proclaiming not ownership but recognition. It is a moment of poetry older than language itself, the first human acknowledgement of otherness as reflection, not opposition. Yet, as in so many ancient tales, harmony cannot endure untested. In nearly every culture, the relationship between man and woman becomes a microcosm of cosmic tension. In Greek mythology, Pandora opens the jar that unleashes suffering into the world. In Sumerian myth, Inanna's descent into the underworld leads to her husband Dumuzi's death. In Egyptian myth, Isis's devotion to Osiris restores life but also exposes mortality. The pattern is universal: creation through union, suffering through separation. And Genesis follows that rhythm with haunting simplicity. When the serpent tempts Eve, it is not because she is weak, but because she stands at the threshold between divinity and humanity. The woman has always been the intermediary in myth, the one who bears life, who perceives mysteries, who bridges realms. Her curiosity is not rebellion alone. It is the ancient impulse of creation itself, the desire to know, to give birth to understanding. In reaching for the fruit, she reenacts the gesture of every goddess who ever sought wisdom for the world. Yet, in this version, that quest becomes the turning point of history. The Hebrew authors transformed myth into morality, but they preserved the woman's spiritual depth. Eve's act awakens both her and Adam. It brings awareness, pain, and mortality, but also the beginning of choice, love, and lineage. The curse pronounced upon her, "In pain you shall bring forth children," is not only physical. It is symbolic of the human condition itself, that life and suffering are intertwined, that creation requires sacrifice. The woman becomes both the bearer of life and the bearer of its cost. It is telling that even after exile, Eve is named not in shame but in honor. Her name, Mother of all living, is a benediction. Through her, the divine purpose continues. Through her, mortality becomes the vessel of immortality. The very act that brought death into the world also ensures that life will never cease. In this paradox lies the heart of Genesis, that what seems like punishment is also the seed of redemption. The man, too, carries his share of the ancient burden. Adam's curse, "By the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread," echoes the toil of the first humans in every myth who must labor after paradise is lost. In the Sumerian story of Adapa, the man who refused the food of life returns to earth to work and die, yet he retains divine wisdom. In the Egyptian texts, humans are born from the tears of the sun god Ra, destined to labor beneath his gaze. The fall from divine ease to mortal struggle is a universal memory, older than any single scripture. The Bible preserves this memory, but reframes it not as tragedy, but as calling. Labor becomes sacred, a participation in the divine act of sustaining creation. The bond between Adam and Eve, though fractured, remains the cornerstone of humanity's story. In exile, they are no longer God's playthings but God's children. Their union, once pure instinct, becomes a covenant of endurance. They are forced to build, to love, to bury, and to begin again. In this, they embody the cycle of all humanity: creation, fall, redemption. Even outside the biblical tradition, this image of the first pair continued to evolve. In ancient Iran, Zoroastrian texts spoke of Mashia and Mashiona, the first man and woman born from a plant. They too are deceived by an evil spirit, forget their divine nature, and begin to eat the food of mortality. Like Adam and Eve, they populate the world through repentance and labor. The parallels reveal that the story's power lies not in its details, but in its truth about the human heart. Throughout these overlapping myths, one truth persists, that the union of man and woman mirrors the divine order. The Bible's innovation was not to deny this, but to sanctify it. The male and female are no longer cosmic forces, but living souls. Their love, fragile and flawed, becomes the stage upon which the divine drama of history unfolds. The ancient world saw the gods as beings of power. Genesis sees God as being of relationship, and within that relationship, man and woman are both image and echo. Together they reflect what no single god or goddess could express alone: the unity of opposites that sustains all creation. As the story of Adam and Eve moves beyond the garden, their figures grow quieter, yet more profound. They are no longer symbols of cosmic balance, but of human endurance. They carry within them the memory of paradise and the hope of return. In them, all humanity recognizes its reflection, divine in origin, yet forever striving to rediscover that sacred harmony that once existed between creator and creation, man and woman, heaven and earth. The serpent has always slithered between worlds, between divine and mortal, between wisdom and deception, between creation and chaos. Long before Genesis, ancient cultures already revered and feared the serpent as a sacred being, a symbol of rebirth, fertility, and secret knowledge. In the biblical story, however, this timeless creature undergoes a profound transformation. From sacred guardian to tempter, from symbol of healing to harbinger of downfall. In the Sumerian myths, the serpent was not evil. It was the guardian of life. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the serpent steals the plant of immortality, not out of malice, but as a creature of the natural cycle. It renews itself through the shedding of its skin, embodying eternal return. In Egyptian religion, the serpent could be both protective and destructive. Mehen coiled around Ra to shield him on his journey through the underworld, while Apophis sought to devour the sun each night. Even in the temples of Babylon, serpents were carved upon the gates as emblems of divine wisdom. So why did Genesis make the serpent the villain? Because the serpent, in Hebrew tradition, became the perfect vessel for a deeper truth. That knowledge, once forbidden, separates humanity from innocence. The Garden of Eden is not merely a place, but a state of divine intimacy, a world where humans walk with God without fear. The serpent's whisper, "You shall not surely die. You shall be as gods, knowing good and evil," is not a simple lie. It is a paradox. For indeed, after eating the fruit, Adam and Eve do gain knowledge. They see themselves as separate beings. They feel shame, desire, vulnerability. They awaken to duality, the very awareness that defines consciousness itself. This transformation mirrors countless older myths of forbidden wisdom. In Mesopotamia, the god Enki defied the supreme deity Anu to bring knowledge and culture to humankind. He taught writing, architecture, and medicine, the same gifts that made civilization possible. In Greek myth, Prometheus stole fire from Olympus to give it to mortals, earning eternal punishment. In each case, enlightenment comes at a cost. Humanity gains self-awareness but loses innocence, gains power but suffers mortality. Genesis takes this ancient theme and gives it spiritual depth. The serpent's deception becomes the turning point of history, the moment when humanity steps into freedom. By eating the fruit, Adam and Eve disobey God, but they also choose. It is the first act of human will. In that moment, they cease to be mere creations and become moral beings, capable of love, of error, of faith. The forbidden fruit itself, never described as an apple in the original Hebrew, may have been inspired by earlier symbols of life and knowledge. The Sumerians spoke of the plant of birth, the Egyptians of the tree of life, and the Persians of the Halma, a sacred tree that granted wisdom. The Garden of Eden, with its rivers and fertile abundance, bears a striking resemblance to Dilmun, the Sumerian paradise described as a place pure, bright, and untouched by death. There, too, no one grew old, no one wept, and the gods walked freely among the living. But while the pagan Edens were distant realms for the gods, the Hebrew Eden was intimate, a home shared with humanity. This closeness makes the fall even more tragic. When Adam and Eve eat the fruit, the rupture is not only moral but relational. They hide from God, who once strolled with them in the cool of the evening. For the first time, divine presence becomes something to fear. Yet, even in exile, there is mercy. Before sending them out, God clothes them, an act of tenderness that echoes ancient myths of divine compassion. In the Sumerian tale of Adapa, the first man loses immortality through misunderstanding, but retains divine wisdom. In the Bible, humanity loses paradise but gains purpose. The expulsion from Eden is not simply punishment, it is initiation. Humanity is cast into the world to learn, to struggle, to create, to complete the work of the divine through experience. The serpent, now cursed to crawl upon its belly, becomes the eternal reminder of what was lost and what was gained. But beneath the surface, its old symbolism remains. In later Hebrew tradition, Moses raises a bronze serpent in the wilderness, Nehushtan, to heal the people from venomous bites. In Christian thought, this image becomes a foreshadowing of redemption. The very creature that once brought death now becomes a symbol of salvation. Across cultures, the serpent's transformation mirrors humanity's journey, from instinct to reason, from innocence to understanding. In Eden, it tempts. In the desert, it heals. In mysticism, it awakens, coiling up the spine as Kundalini, the serpent of divine energy. What began as a symbol of fall becomes, in later ages, a symbol of ascent. The Garden of Eden, too, lingers in humanity's memory not as myth, but as yearning. Every paradise since, from the Hesperides of Greece to the Isles of the Blessed in Celtic lore, echoes that lost perfection. The garden is the archetype of origin, innocence, and reunion. It is the place we remember but cannot return to. In the end, Genesis turns what the ancients saw as cycles into a single unfolding story. The serpent, the man, and the woman are no longer gods in disguise, but human actors in a divine drama. The garden is no longer a realm of eternal recurrence, but the beginning of a journey toward redemption. Humanity's exile is not the end of paradise. It is the beginning of history. Before Eve took her first breath, another woman was said to have walked beside Adam, not from his rib, but from the same dust, equal in creation, equal in will. Her name was Lilith, and though her story was later buried beneath centuries of silence, whispers of her name echo in ancient myth and occult memory, a figure of rebellion, mystery, and misunderstood divinity. To speak of her is to enter the twilight between myth and scripture, where sacred memory meets the shadows of forgotten gods. Lilith's story does not appear in Genesis as we know it. In the canonical Bible, she is but a faint echo, a single line in the book of Isaiah, where a night creature dwells in desolate places. Yet her myth blooms in the ancient midrashim and mystical texts of the Hebrew world. There, she is described as the first companion of Adam, created from the same earth. Unlike Eve, she refused submission. "We are equal," she declared, "for we were created together." When Adam demanded her obedience, she pronounced the unspeakable name of God and fled from Eden. This act of defiance has been interpreted in countless ways. Some see in Lilith the first symbol of female independence, the human voice refusing domination. Others see a darker shadow, the dangerous autonomy that leads away from divine order. But behind this polarity lies something deeper. Lilith is not merely a character. She is an inheritance from a world older than the Bible itself. Long before the Hebrews told of Adam, the Sumerians and Babylonians spoke of night spirits, goddesses of air and desire, known as the Lilitu. These beings were neither wholly divine nor demonic. They moved between realms, haunting dreams, seducing the unwary, and embodying the mysteries of fertility and death. Among them was Inanna, goddess of heaven and love, who descended into the underworld seeking knowledge, and Ishtar, whose power spanned both life and war. Lilith may have been born from the fading light of these goddesses, once revered, later demonized as patriarchal religions rose. As the ancient world transitioned from polytheism to monotheism, many feminine symbols of divine power were recast as dangerous or fallen. The serpent goddess became Satan's accomplice, the Earth Mother became mortal Eve, and Lilith, the untamed feminine, became a warning. Yet her essence remained. She carried within her the memory of balance, of a time when the divine feminine was not feared, but worshipped. The myth of Lilith is also tied to the idea of divine separation, the splitting of unity into polarity. In early mysticism, Adam before Eve was androgynous, embodying both masculine and feminine aspects in one being. The creation of Eve from Adam's rib symbolized the division necessary for relationship and reflection. But in the Lilith legend, that division occurred through conflict, not harmony. Lilith refused to yield, and so she left, leaving Adam alone until Eve was formed from his flesh, a being bound by love and mutual dependence rather than equality. Some scholars see in this the echo of ancient fertility myths. In Sumerian religion, Inanna's descent into the underworld mirrors the rhythm of life and death, growth and decay. In leaving the garden, Lilith mirrors the goddess's descent, departing from divine order to dwell among shadows, yet still holding sacred knowledge. She becomes the archetype of exile, the embodiment of the part of creation that refuses to submit, yet cannot be erased. Over centuries, Lilith's image darkened. In Jewish folklore, she was said to prey on newborn children, to visit men in their sleep, to bring storms and disease. Amulets bearing her name were used to ward her off. Yet these same tales reveal a strange respect, a recognition of her power. She was feared, but she was not forgotten. In the Zohar, the central text of Jewish mysticism, Lilith is the consort of Samael, the fallen angel. Together they represent the dark reflection of divine unity. But even there, she is portrayed as necessary. For without shadow, there can be no light. In this way, the story of Lilith becomes the hidden counterpart to the story of Eve. Eve is the vessel of life. Lilith, the voice of freedom. Eve represents obedience that leads to knowledge. Lilith, rebellion that leads to exile. Together, they mirror humanity's dual nature, the desire to belong and the yearning to be free. The ancient pagans understood this duality well. The goddesses they worshipped, Ishtar, Isis, Astarte, were never purely benevolent. They ruled over both creation and destruction, love and wrath. Their myths taught that divinity itself embraces opposites. The Hebrews, inheriting this symbolic world, sought to purify it, to draw clear lines between good and evil, divine and human. But the old myths did not vanish. They whispered through the cracks, in apocryphal texts, in mystical visions, in the shadows of the sacred. When we look deeper, we see that Lilith is not the enemy of God, but the reflection of a truth humanity was not yet ready to face. That divine order includes the freedom to choose, even to disobey. Just as Adam and Eve's fall led to knowledge, Lilith's exile represents the awakening of individuality, the cost of autonomy in a world ruled by law. In later traditions, especially within Kabbalah, this paradox was understood not as rebellion against God, but as part of the divine unfolding. The world, according to mystics, was created through contraction, God withdrawing to allow space for the other. In that space of absence, freedom is born, and with freedom comes the possibility of error. Lilith, then, becomes not a demon, but a symbol of that necessary distance, the space in which humanity can choose love over fear, creation over destruction. The myth of Lilith has endured because it speaks to something timeless within the human spirit, the struggle between submission and freedom, unity and solitude, belonging and exile. Every civilization has its Lilith. In Greek myth, Pandora, the first woman, opens the jar that releases all suffering into the world. In Gnostic writings, Sophia, divine wisdom herself, falls from the heavens seeking understanding. In Mesopotamia, Ereshkigal, the Dark Queen, reigns in the underworld with both terror and majesty. These are not separate stories. They are facets of one ancient truth, that the journey toward knowledge begins with the courage to leave paradise. And so, in the quiet reflection of these myths, we see that the story of Adam and Eve is not simply about the beginning of sin, but about the beginning of consciousness. Eve's choice and Lilith's defiance are two threads of the same awakening. The garden represents unity without awareness, the world beyond it, separation with a promise of reunion. Humanity walks between these realms, between light and shadow, obedience and will, forever seeking the divine harmony once lost, and yet ever present within. Perhaps that is the final lesson of these ancient parallels. The Bible, far from erasing the old stories, absorbs them, transforms them, redeems them. The pagan myths provided the symbols. The scriptures gave them purpose. The serpent, the garden, the woman, the fall, All these are fragments of a universal story about the soul's journey toward God. In the end, to study the pagan origins of biblical tales is not to diminish their holiness, but to marvel at their universality. Across deserts and temples, from Babylon to Jerusalem, from Sumer to Sinai, humanity has spoken in many tongues but sought the same mystery, the longing to understand the divine image within ourselves. The story of Adam and Eve, seen through this ancient mirror, becomes more than a tale of loss. It becomes a revelation of the divine plan written in mythic language, that through knowledge, suffering, and love, humanity might one day return not to the garden behind us, but to the paradise ahead. For paradise is not merely a place once lost, but a state to be regained, when wisdom and innocence, freedom and faith, the feminine and the masculine, are reconciled once more. And perhaps, when that day comes, even Lilith will walk again beside Adam, not in defiance, not in subjugation, but in the harmony that was always meant to be.